to let the room populate for a second, then we'll get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Johnson, Vice President of Development at National Review Institute. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the fight against woke academia, which might be a redundant term. As a quick note, before we get started on our program, the 9th annual William F. Buckley Jr. Prize Dinner will be held at the Reagan Presidential Library in California this fall. This year's dinner on September 29th will honor Larry Kudlow and Young America's Foundation. Rich Lowry and many of your favorite National Review writers will be in attendance. Sure to be a fun night with dinner, dancing, and cocktails. The tickets are going fast, so please make your reservation soon. You can visit our website, nrinstitute.org, for more information and to reserve your ticket. Now on to our program. As students return to campuses, we felt it would be a good time to partner with Speech First to talk about all that they're doing to protect free speech on college campuses. They recently released a study entitled Freshman Disorientation: How Colleges and Universities Lay the Groundwork for Student Indoctrination. NRI fellow Kevin Williamson is joined today by Cherise Trump, who is Speech First's Executive Director and a dogged champion for free speech on college campuses. Previously, Cherise worked at the Heritage Foundation, and she is host of Speech First's new live show and podcast, Well Said. Cherise and Speech First have had several impressive legal victories since their founding in 2018. Now I'll hand it over to Kevin.
Hi, thank you. Cherise, have you ever thought about changing your middle name to no relation just to save yourself time?
That's actually not a bad idea. Yeah, but I really should do that there. But specifying up front, no relation for everyone who's watching.
Have you ever, if you Google yourself, by the way, that's the first suggested Google question that comes up is whether you are.
Oh yeah, I understand that. I think a couple articles recently, some clickbait ones came out about whether or not I'm related to the president.
Well, thanks so much for being here. I know people are always interested in these issues. When people ask me to sign books, the number one thing they ask me to write in them is don't believe everything your professors tell you next year, because they're giving them to kids who've graduated and they're going off to college. So I know this is a real issue. I'll tell you a story real quick, one that jumps to mind. Big State University has a debate about multicultural requirements. People in the liberal arts think there's not enough of it, and they want to pass a requirement that says every student has to take a multicultural course to graduate. And over in math and engineering, they say, we don't really think it's a very good idea because most of our programs essentially already are functionally 5-year programs, and we don't want to put any more requirements on them. But secondly, 25 or 30% of our students are foreign students who grew up in non-English speaking households who don't need to be told about foreign cultures because, you know, they come from those places. So it goes to the faculty senate. It's a huge, bitter debate. And the deciding vote against it is cast by a guy who is a card-carrying liberal Democrat, you know, who is sympathetic to these issues, but he agrees that it's just not a good, you know, one-size-fits-all solution. There's swastikas painted on his office door. He's eventually driven from his job in spite of the fact that he's a tenured full professor. 1990, this was at the University of Texas. So things have been crazy for a while. I can't imagine they've got a lot better since I was an English major at UT way back when. Do you want to give us sort of a rundown on the state of speech stifling on campuses and your organization's role in dealing with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Just, you know, up front, I'll give a little bit of background on Speech First and what we do. So we litigate on behalf of our student members against universities that violate their free speech rights on campus, as well as we also advocate for students' free speech rights and educate them on their legal rights and educate the public as well on some growing trends, as we're doing right now with what we're seeing on campuses at colleges and universities. We recently, so we do a lot of litigation, obviously, and we recently had a successful lawsuits against University of Central Florida and the 11th Circuit and the University of Houston, actually down at the district level in Texas. And I'll say kind of some of those lawsuits touch on some of the major issues that we're seeing on campus right now. So with UCF, we won at the 11th Circuit with against their bias response teams and their discriminatory harassment policy. And the bias response teams is probably one of the things I'm most concerned about with what's going on campus, because a lot of folks just don't know about it who are off campus. The students know about it, but not so much folks who are off campus. And it's because the universities do a really great job hiding this in their various policy, student code of handbooks. And they don't really publicize it as much as they used to. Now, they used to publicize bias response teams quite a bit by sending out articles about how this is a reporting mechanism that's going to help increase diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. But oftentimes we are seeing the opposite, which is where it stifles free speech. It tamps down on students' abilities to speak out about issues they care a lot about, and it essentially censors them. So what a bias response team is.
Before you go on.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about what these programs actually are and how they work and how they're set up.
For sure. Yeah. So to clarify, because I know when you hear bias response team, you're like, what is that? That sounds like a very strange thing. What it is it's essentially an administrative body on campus that's designed to solicit reports from students on one another. And oftentimes these reports are meant to be anonymous for various things such as a bias incident, right? So the university defines bias incident however it wants, which it can be. There's no like set standard for what a bias incident is. It could be offensive speech. This is oftentimes the examples they include are offensive speech, unwanted speech, political emails, political conversations, sometimes offending someone's political affiliation, microaggressions, cultural appropriation, all of these things that we hear of all the time in kind of like the woke jargon of what's bad, essentially is going to be what they consider a bias incident. Now, students tend to use these quite a bit. And I'll get into a little bit kind of why we think that is. But what they do is once a student reports another student anonymously, the one who's reported actually will get an email usually from this administrative body, which usually consists of diversity, equity, and inclusion officers from the department there. Sometimes a campus police officer will be on it, and also various deans are usually on it as well. And they'll get an email that says, hey, you've been reported for a bias incident. It could be anything from telling a joke that offended someone, posting an emoji on social media, and these students have no idea what or who, why they're being reported. Then all of a sudden they have to come in, meet with the dean or a DEI officer and discuss the issue. So they're already having a record kept on them. They're being investigated, and they have no idea who reported them or really why until they get in. And usually it will lead to mandated diversity training afterwards, which is a form of punishment, as well as sometimes an apology letter. So this is a serious concern because it's obvious that this is violating students' free speech rights. This is everything I listed off in the description of bias incident is all constitutionally protected forms of speech. So this is where we really run into the law here. And so we went after University of Central Florida for their Just Knights response team, which is essentially another form of a bias response team. We also went after them and the University of Houston for their discriminatory harassment policies or their anti-harassment policies. This is another big issue we were seeing on campuses, and I can talk a little bit also about how the Title IX question is going to play into this with the new rules being proposed by the Biden administration. But right now, just to know that the most recent rules were in 2020 for how sexual harassment is going to be defined on campus. There is no set standard about how many other additional harassment policies a university can have. So they'll often have their Title IX sexual harassment policy, and then they'll proceed to list additional definitions of other forms of harassment like discriminatory harassment. And again, there's no set standard, legal standard for what this is. So oftentimes universities will just kind of define it again, however they want. They'll say, again, offensive speech, joking, stereotyping. In the case of Houston, they actually said microaggressions, offensive jokes and unwanted jokes and offensive stereotypes. So they actually do list examples for students to go off of. Again, these are all public institutions. They're taxpayer funded, which means they're extensions of the state. And that means you have the state now imposing rules and policies and regulations on students that directly violate their First Amendment rights. So this is obviously a serious concern, which is why we had a very quick and decisive win against the University of Houston when we brought the harassment policy issue to the judge. And so this is something that, again, like I want to emphasize that it is really important on the litigation side for all those who are interested on the lawsuits that we are as aggressive and decisive as possible when we go after these universities. You can close your eyes and point to a school on a map and you'll find one with a bad harassment policy. I guarantee it. It is what we call a target rich environment. There is no shortage of bad actors on universities. So any of those who are involved in litigation or who are interested in it, definitely keep us posted on what's going on, because we're always very interested in that. Additionally, so we've got the cases, but we also have published reports recently. And I'll talk a little bit about the bias response team stuff some more, because we just published a report where we looked at over 800 universities, public and private, and found that about 56% of them have these bias reporting systems that I mentioned. And like I said, this is something that it's not only a direct violation of students' rights, but it's like something out of East Germany. You're having students anonymously report on each other. You're encouraging, you're soliciting these reports, and then they're reporting to what essentially is like these censor squads or the Stasi, right? So this is something that the students are using very much so, and it's because the university is encouraging it. And we wanted to know why the university, how is the university encouraging it? And why are students so eager to report on one another, right? So this is something we wanted to figure out, which is what led to our second report on freshman orientations. We call it the freshman disorientation report, because essentially we found, we sent freedom of information requests to over 50 universities across the country, and found if in the results of kind of figuring out what it is that they're telling students, how much they're talking about DEI and critical race theory and microaggressions and all of these things. What are they saying about social media policies? What are they saying about computer use policies and harassment policies? And we found that 91% of the materials focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory, social justice movements, Black Lives Matter, microaggressions, all these things that we constantly hear about with, within kind of like the woke terminology context, were all mentioned. And it's hours of PowerPoint presentations, hours of videos and slides and handouts. So these students are being hit over the head with this. We also look to see how often they mentioned free speech and viewpoint diversity. And I'll tell you, only 30% of the schools even mentioned those things once. And of the ones who did mention it, it was still a 7-to-1 ratio of how much they were talking about DEI, CRT versus free speech and viewpoint diversity. So that's, I'm getting
for a second.
Yeah.
What if you give us maybe a couple of examples of things that have been reported
Yeah.
as bias incidents? Because I know we're not talking about cross burnings here. And that
No,
sort of
yeah.
thing. We're talking about people quoting from the Wall Street Journal.
Exactly. Yes. No, it's actually because the schools they emphasize these trigger warnings, these microaggression concepts so much with the students. They're looking around all the time for reasons to be offended. That is essentially what they're being trained to do. And so, yes, we've seen incidents where actually an article just came out today in College Fix, and I just saw that a student was reported to the bias response team at the University of Arizona because she drew a person picking cotton because she was playing a Pictionary game where she had to draw cotton. And so she drew like a farm person picking a crop, and someone reported her to the bias response team. We've seen like puke face emojis, being reported because they offended someone. Someone else put like a puke face emoji on their social media account and it offended someone. We've seen people reported for simply laughing at a joke that someone else found offensive. So the person who told the joke was reported, and the person who laughed at it was also reported. We've seen people report things like the term Saudi Arabia was written on a whiteboard. No one was accused in that situation because no one knew who wrote it, but it was still reported to the bias response team. So it just goes to show that
on what grounds was the Saudi Arabia just a word?
It just somehow offended someone enough for them to send a report. This is why there's no clear definition.
Like hooray Saudi Arabia, just the words.
It was literally just the words Saudi Arabia written on the whiteboard. And it was, honestly, I don't even know how the administrators would process something like that, because they would probably be thinking, what's the offense here? But look, they're the ones who started this. They opened this door and this can of worms, saying you should be offended by everything. You should always be looking to be offended by things. And here's a tool at your disposal to report all the things that you're offended by. And I will say some of them are much more insidious and much more dangerous. So you see like Georgetown University lists bias incident under a crime that you can report on their campus police website. So that is like literal thought police right there. It does get much more serious. Students who are with but like ideological organizations like Turning Point or Young Americans for Liberty, Young Americans for Freedom, these more conservative organizations on campus are constantly constantly reported for tabling on various issues that they want to talk about, or handing out flyers that someone doesn't like. Again, these are all things that are constitutionally protected, but they're getting reported left and right for having opinions that differ from oftentimes what the left woke ideology is.
About that, one thing I did want to ask you about is that, if you're in Turning Point as an undergraduate, you're sort of on campus to start a fight. I mean, I showed up at college ready to start a fight. I was already a National Review reader, and I kind of knew what I wanted to do, and I was sort of involved in journalism and activism already.
Yeah.
But most students aren't, and it's a very different thing, I think, for if you're 19-year-old Charlie Kirk and you're an undergraduate or whatever, it's fine. You're sort of used to it. It's what you expect. But the effect on people who are not politically engaged in that way, who aren't, working for their school newspaper, who aren't members of Young Conservatives or YAF or College Republicans or something like that, a very different sort of thing. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how
so you have
their ability to speak.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are different kind of types of students who are much more outspoken. So you have like the Charlie Kirks on campus, right? For example, who are like ready to go. They're ready for a fight. They don't care how many times they get reported to the bias response team. They're going to keep speaking up. They're not going to let it deter them from expressing their opinions. And that's great. And that takes a lot of courage. That is still a very, very small minority on campus of students who are willing to do that. And even more so now, and I think FIRE just released a report last year saying that 80% of students report that they self-censor at one time or another. So this is, students on both sides of the spectrum are censoring themselves because they just don't want to deal with controversy. But also, it's not just a matter of not wanting to deal with controversy. In addition to not wanting to get in an argument with someone, nowadays, they just also don't want to deal with the process of getting reported and having to deal with the administrators, because that is a whole nother level that it adds now to. It's like, okay, I don't want to get, lambasted on social media, but now I also don't want to have to go into the dean's office and write a letter of apology or have to go to mandated diversity training again. Like, I just don't want to have to do that. So they just choose not to speak up. But I will say in those same chapters, those like College Republicans and Young Americans and all these things, these Turning Point chapters, there's also a cohort in there that is just looking for some sort of safe haven to be able to express themselves, because a lot of times, I was just at the Turning Point conference a few weeks ago. I asked the room how many of them were STEM majors, were from like math, science fields. Almost everyone raised their hands. So it is not just students who are politically driven and who are in the social science fields. Now you see students who are studying medicine and engineering and computer science who are looking for kind of an opportunity to talk about some of the crazy things they're hearing in their classroom that they can't debate about on their campus. So there is a various layers of like how willing the students are to speak out. And I'll say speech first. Obviously we're defending our members that are definitely feel like their speech is chilled. Like they will sign in their declarations that their speech is chilled because of these policies. And that is something that, when we see these students who are very outspoken, they're really great at like what they do. And again, we commend their courage, but at the same time, they don't represent the majority of students on campus. Oftentimes they are in the minority. And on the freshman orientation stuff, I will continue real quickly because I just want to point out some examples of some of the things we saw in that report. So we found that, like I said, only a third of campuses even talked about free speech or viewpoint diversity, but also some of the stuff we saw, some of the examples are really, really horrendous. You see, University of Nevada, Las Vegas has a list of definitions where they define they define various terms. And one of the terms they define is racism. And they say that it's specifically based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. So they actually use the term or white people in their definition of racism. And you'll see at other schools, we found that a lot of schools across the country are using what's called this implicit bias test. I don't know if you've heard of it. Yeah. So it's housed on Harvard's website, but you have facilitators across the country who help send this out to various universities. And essentially what it is, and oftentimes students will be required to create an account that's attached to whatever the results are with their email address. So there will be opportunity for tracking and seeing kind of what, if they're determined they're implicitly biased, but they have to take this test to essentially you're matching skin tone. I took it just for fun to see like kind of what it makes you do. It makes you match shades of skin tone to positive and negative words. And if you do it too quickly or you do it too slow, it like times your click rate. So and it will say that you are implicitly biased against a race. They have all sorts of tests, not just with race. They also do it with transgender stuff, with sexuality stuff. But they also had one which I thought was very strange about race and weapons. So you have to match black people or white people to positive and negative words at the same time. You're also matching them to guns or brass knuckles or knives or other inanimate objects. It's very strange, but it does trick the mind because you're constantly thinking these things. So it's very interesting. But again, if you're wondering where these seeds of insecurity are coming from with students, this is what they're going through at the beginning when they enter campus. And I'm almost confident that we are at the, scratching the surface with regards to how bad these freshman orientations are. I've heard of what are called privilege marches, where students have to go outside and line up, and as a professor or an administrator, list off various forms of privilege, whether like, oh, if Band-Aids are your same skin color, then you step forward. And if not, then you step backwards. And it's supposed to show students the disparity of their privilege. There's an entire, I found it was at the University of Minnesota, I forget what school it was, but an entire like hour-and-a-half long PowerPoint slide on the discrepancies between power relationships with the races. Like, again, students are just being hit over the head with this stuff when they first enter campus. So it just goes on and on and on. But that's why we realize, okay, now no wonder they're all reporting each other to these bias response teams. So the schools make them look over the shoulder. They create this sense of enmity amongst the students, and then they give them the mechanisms to follow through with it, which is with these bias reporting systems and these bias response teams. So that's the kind of stuff that we're focusing a lot on Speech First. Those are the policies that we're really concerned about. Now, I will say though, there are obviously some concerning issues with regards to free speech zones. And these are some of the older trends, things that we've seen on campus for a while that are really starting to dissipate because there's been enough lawsuits, enough legal action against universities to help combat this, which is like, the free speech zone. Club recognition was something that there's still struggle there, getting conservative clubs recognized on campus. I've seen schools try to deny religious organizations from being recognized as a club because they limit and restrict who their members can be to, say, Christian or Jewish. But there's a really easy, solid legal argument against that, which is that other clubs on campus also, such as like veterans or organization clubs, will restrict their membership based on veteran status, or, international clubs restrict their membership based on demographics and ethnic backgrounds. So this is something that they don't have a strong argument against. They just try to see how much they can get away with before someone threatens a lawsuit. So one thing at Speech First, if this might make everyone who's viewing this happy, is so again, universities do try to see how much they can get away with. They're not dumb. They have legal counsel internally in their administrative bodies. And so they know that oftentimes they're walking right up to that legal line or definitely crossing it. And they just want to see what they can do and how much they can tamp down on students' free expression. And a lot of folks will write letters and kind of say, hey, we're going to threaten a lawsuit against you. And then the university is like, okay, maybe we'll change it. Maybe not. We'll see what really happens. But Speech First, we just sue them because we know that they're bad actors in these situations. We know that they are actively violating students' rights. They know that they're doing it and they're trying to get away with it. And so we don't really give them any letters of warning. We just go straight in for the kill, essentially. And make sure, yeah.
What are those rights? I think a lot of people maybe are not entirely clear on what a student's First Amendment rights and free speech rights look like on campus. You talk about the administrations walking up to the line, but where is it?
Yeah. Well, so it does differ on public and private campuses. So obviously we litigate against public universities, and with public universities, again, they are taxpayer funded. They're extensions of the state. They are 100% beholden to the Constitution and to the law of the land. So that one is an easy, obvious question when you go and look in their policies. If they put any limitations on speech, essentially they are violating First Amendment rights with regards to free speech. And if a lot of times students, first of all, students for the most part think that hate speech is actually illegal. In this country, it is not illegal. It is protected under the First Amendment, because who defines hate, right? It is a very subjective term. And this is why the Supreme Court has upheld that precedent time and time again. So again, it's important for students. Yeah, a lot of times schools will try to say offensive or hate speech or biased speech is against the rules. If you're at a public university, they absolutely cannot enforce that against you. Now, at a private school, it's a little different because you have a different contractual relationship. You've agreed to come to a university that has that is private and has certain exceptions in their own like student code of conduct. Now, granted, they're still beholden to like Title VI and Title IX and Title VII, all of these federal stipulations for under the Civil Rights Act, but with regards to speech, obviously you have like religious institutions that are going to talk about religious issues on campus. They're going to discuss various things in those topics. And that's something that when the student agrees to go there, that they have signed up for that essentially, right? But one thing I will mention is if you're at a private university and your school has a free expression agreement with you, and oftentimes universities will these days say, okay, we sign on the Chicago Principles of Free Expression, or we promise, at the beginning of the Student Code of Conduct Handbook, they'll say like, we promise to protect your rights and your free speech rights, and we support your ability to speak up. And then they turn around and have all these additional policies. There is an avenue there for you to file a claim against them for breach of contract, or if someone tries to report you for something or go after you because you expressed your ideas, that maybe you can accuse the school of neglect on that front. You can also accuse them of fraud. So there are some contractual things that you can do because of the private school aspect. You do have to approach it in a slightly different way than you would with the public school. And so that's something that again, with students, I always encourage, do a very close read with the Code of Conduct Handbook. Look at your policies very closely, especially the harassment policies. It's where a lot of things get snuck in. And so just like look at it and ask yourself, does this sound legally sound to me? Or does this look legally sound to me? Is this something that if I spoke up, could I get accused of this? Just kind of ask yourself that question while you're looking through, because there are organizations and institutions we've found, like PEN America on the left, that actively try to create guidelines for schools that say, here's how you can have a bias response team without crossing the legal line, and they'll break it down. So in my opinion, all bias reporting systems should just be gone. They're bad for the school, they're bad for students, and they're just bad for educational intellectual development. But there is a legal version of them, right? Like if they don't have like a formalized administrative team, if they're not leading to actual investigations or actual disciplinary measures, but students are still reporting on each other, but the school doesn't discipline the student and they don't threaten discipline. So there are ways for the schools to get around this. And it just shows how insidious the issue is, because they want to be able to hold on to this concept and this policy without actually breaking the law. And that's very important to them in some cases, because they want to make sure that organizations like us can't come after them, but they still get to have their woke dogmatic ideology promulgated all over campus in the same way. So that's where public influence comes in. That's where state legislators can step in, and then the federal government can step in by actually putting requirements in. That's like, no, it's like if you don't protect free speech on your campus, you don't get federal funds or you don't get state funds. There are other paths here other than just suing the school. So public education and making sure everyone knows what's going on, getting the word out, is a big part of that as well, to put pressure on the universities.
Yeah, we've seen situations where, for instance, students had been admitted to a university and had their admission revoked because maybe something they said or tweeted when they were 15 years old, something like that. Is it legal for universities to discipline a student in that way over speech, even stupid and regrettable speech?
So for private school, they could have a very strict code of conduct that the student, if again, this comes back to making sure you do your research with what school you're going to, and knowing what you're signing up for, what you're about to pay a bunch of money for, because it's not just the financial consequence, but it's also the fact that you might be going to a school that's basically like, no, especially if it's a private university, you might be going to a school that says, No, we'd actually, we have such a strict code of conduct that any misbehavior, any phrases that fit into this category could get you expelled. And as a private institution, they do have the ability to do that as long as they're not discriminating. And so this is something that at a public school, though, again, no, they cannot do that. They cannot expel you for something you put on social media. It's absolutely not, unless it's like something that violates actual law. They can't do it just because they don't like what you posted.
Are you worried or at all depressed by the fact that so many students are so enthusiastic about these things? That they seem to like having this avenue of being able to impose sanctions on their fellow students. When I was in high school, we were constantly fighting with our school administration about they would ban T-shirts of various kinds and things like that, or other kinds of communication. We just, of course, we're not inclined to put up with that sort of thing. And I think that really held true throughout most of my college years. But something really seems to have changed in young people where they've taken on, if anything, they are to the repressive side, faculties often in these disputes.
Yeah. So it is disconcerting to see how many students are willing to report on one another. I think that is a deeper seated issue that starts before college with regards to wanting to participate in debates, wanting to do the work and the research to know the issues you care a lot about, and then wanting to learn and grow from conversations with people. That desire, I think, a lot of students still have that in a lot of cases, but then when you put them on a campus and put them in an environment where all the figures of authority are telling them that you should be very easily offended, you should all be very careful, it's super easy to offend someone, and here are the mechanisms on how to report anytime you're offended, and we'll be there and we'll hold your hand through the process. That right there is already putting students in a very different mindset than the type that you would expect them to have when they enter campus and they're like ready to go and they want to, grow their minds and grow their intellectual capacity. And so it shifts them completely out of gear when it comes to that type of rhetoric. And that's what I see oftentimes universities encouraging. Now, I will say there are also a lot of students, if not all.
Why the university is encouraging this, do you think?
Well, I mean, my speculation is that there's a political agenda. It's become pretty clear, especially with the information that I've seen with freshman orientations, and just generally as you watch campuses closely, it becomes very apparent that universities are, for the most part, the administrators have they are very, very strong political ideologies, and they have very strong political agendas, and they intend to use universities to accomplish those ends. And whether they're using it as a training grounds for social justice warriors, or whether they are attempting to indoctrinate and brainwash students, or just show that if you have a dissenting opinion, you are not going to be protected. You do not get to speak up. You do not get to express yourself. Again, something out of the cultural revolution of Marxism. This is not something that we haven't seen before in history. And it's happening right before our eyes. And we're just and a lot of folks are just kind of complacently letting it go on because they don't want to take money away from universities. They don't want to upset the status quo. But it's really important that we recognize what it is that they're doing and these very insidious policies that they're using to enact it. I will say, though, they have an easier time doing it the less students are educated about their rights. Oftentimes I talk to a student and they do not actually know that, for example, hate speech isn't illegal. They haven't read the entire Constitution. They didn't learn about this in K through 12. They did not talk about they're the principles behind why free speech is so important and so uniquely protected in the United States. That's something that students especially don't seem to recognize, is actually how unique it is that we have such a blanket protection for free speech in this country. If you compare our Constitution to any other country, any Western country even, we still have the most protection for, we say that Congress shall make no law, right? All the other countries that I've ever looked at in the West and Europe and in Canada all have exceptions written into their constitutions. They all say that free speech is a right, except for in these situations. And they usually will list out a few examples. And so it's something that's very unique to the United States and that students actually don't know. And again, this is why and again, they need to know why that is, right? It's so that we can have this open discourse. It's so that we can debate one another freely and get down to the truth of it, because that's what the goal ultimately is. And I'll say one more thing on this. I think that, the schools definitely know that the students are not super savvy on these issues, right? And again, they take full advantage of that. And it is disconcerting to see, so we have probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of foreign students on campus that come in on student visas. They are not educated at all on the rights in this country when they come onto campus. They are not educated on the Constitution, and they are not taught kind of the rules of the culture of the land. And so that's something that is very concerning when you see folks come over and try to mandate trainings on critical race theory. When you see like student government associations trying to mandate trainings on critical race theory for club recognition, or you see, it was at Pomona College that I've seen a few other campuses where they tried to mandate, the student government tried to mandate that all clubs on campus participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, including the Jewish clubs, right? So this is clear viewpoint discrimination. This is clear compelled speech, but the university steps in, and they'll step in and tell them that they can't do it. They don't explain the legal argument to why they can't do it. They don't explain that, free speech is protected. They explain that.
Theory about this, by the way. And
What's
tell
that?
me so I have a theory about this, by the way. Tell me what you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was going to say that instead they usually will say, "Oh, we didn't have enough time to consider it," or "You didn't open this up for students to give their input on the policy." That was the case in the Pomona College one. I was shocked that the president of the university said, "No, you can't mandate everyone to participate in the BDS movement to get club funding." But and then literally leave out all the legal reasoning to why, leave out all of the actual reasons as to why, and just only say it's because they didn't have enough time to debate the issue. Because
my theory is that universities are essentially jobs programs. They're there for patronage. And the problem with that is that it's actually pretty difficult to do the minimum academic work necessary to become a real professor, even of, English or sociology or one of those, less hard subjects. And so the people they hire, they put into these positions because that's what they can do. And they're bored and they need something to do to keep them busy all day. And this is sort of the maximum level of their intellectual engagement. Whenever I come up with a cynical theory like this, I always learn 5 years later that it wasn't cynical enough. But that's kind of, I suspect, where they are. We were talking a little bit earlier about student loans before we started the program. And I also kind of suspect the university just have too much money. There's just too much money floating around the system. It's got to be soaked up somewhere. The easiest way to soak it up is payroll. And the easiest way to build your payroll is by adding a whole bunch of, people with these kind of soft requirements that don't have any real job deliveries.
Yeah, certainly. And I will say that on that issue as well, I mean, when I see situations where if you look at, I always encourage people to also look at their university's 990s if they can. They're all publicly available online, and you can see how much the top administrators make on those 990s. Oftentimes it's over $1 million a year, and sometimes it's and more often than not, it's like even the deans, the vice deans, will be making over $200,000 or over $400,000 a year. So you wonder where this money is going. It's certainly not necessarily going. It's going into the administrative body of the university, which I think speaks a lot to what we're seeing with the policies when we think about bureaucratic systems, right? When we think about how these things are systematized in that way and how they are basically designed to just constantly create rules and regulations, they need a reason to exist, right? These new DEI departments need a reason to exist. So everyone that they hire is going to have a task to like, okay, what is our job here? What kind of rules can we create to justify our existence? What kind of things can we crack down on to justify our existence? So when you see millions upon millions of dollars getting thrown into the administrative level, I mean, I think someone was telling me the other day that it actually used to be that professors were usually the ones that were like presidents, the most renowned professors would eventually take over in leadership roles for the university and take over the administrative role for the university. So it was still people who were, inclined towards the academy and the understanding of, education. They weren't career bureaucrats, which is what we have now. I mean, it's an actual career path to be an administrator for a university. You don't have to actually ever teach. And for example, I mean, but even the professors are, I always think back to this incident that I just heard about, Pamela Carlin at Stanford University, who makes like upwards of $1 million a year as a professor. And she went to go work, and this is just such an interesting story, that's why I want to tell it, is that she went to go work for DOJ. And during that time of working for the DOJ and the Biden administration, she maintained her $1 million salary a year or per year with Stanford. And even though the government was trying to pay her a little under $200,000 a year, they decided to redonate that amount of money to Stanford University. So like her salary at DOJ went back into Stanford University, who was paying her salary. And I'm just thinking of this like corrupt, unethical loop of money. And that's not even to talk about some of the briefs that she wrote that actually supported some of Stanford's policies of discrimination against whites and Asians in the admissions process. So this is something that we need to look much more heavily at, like how corrupt these administrative bodies are at the universities, because when we talk about federal student loans and we talk about where this money is going, this is a serious concern. Like if the government and the taxpayers are supporting education, like what are we supporting here? Or are we supporting the tamping down of free speech rights of students? Is that what
we're supporting it?
What's that?
Of course, we're not. It would be nice if we were supporting education, but of course we're not. We're supporting something closer to the opposite of education.
Right.
Get some questions from the audience here in a second. Folks, if you have anything you want to ask, feel free to put it in the chat. But I did want to ask you a couple of questions about a couple of particular cases before we do that. What's going on at the University of Alabama?
So University of Alabama, we filed an amicus brief recently in that, and this is something we've seen at a couple campuses or a few campuses across the country. And it used to be, I think, more of an issue in the past than it is today. But a lot of universities will like to put restrictions. They call them time and place and manner restrictions on where students can hand out flyers, can table, can speak. Essentially, it's another version of essentially a free speech zone, right? So it's just like a different legal term assigned to it. But with University of Alabama, they actually, as a state university, as long as you're not disrupting a classroom and you are outside, like on the public grounds of the university, they can't really put restrictions on things like chalking, which is not a permanent way of marking something, or handing out flyers. Again, this all comes back to, as a public university, this is all something that's protected under the Constitution. So Young Americans for Liberty and ADF, the Alliance for Defending Freedom, they launched a lawsuit against the University of Alabama, and I believe I haven't followed up with it lately. I don't know where they are. I think they might have they've just gotten up to the Supreme Court of the state, I believe. So that's unless you were asking about a different case, this is the one. Sometimes there's multiple cases going on at universities. So no, but we wrote an amicus brief on how this is just clear violation of students' First Amendment rights. And it was surprising to see it down in Alabama, I'll say, because it's not.
Why?
Well, because you would expect, I guess maybe there is a stereotype that, Southern states tend to be more respectful of conservative ideas and principles, which are more tied to the Constitution, because these states do tend to be red, right? Like they do go red in elections, and you're like, okay, well, if you're voting Republican for the majority of the part, shouldn't the state then, you would assume the state would also, in all of its other institutions, be relatively friendly to the Constitution. But it's surprising.
Introduce you to a place called the University of Texas.
Right, exactly. Well, this is why this is exactly right. And this is the point I was going to make. We went after University of Central Florida, University of Houston, University of Texas, Austin. Like it is I don't want to say this. It's like I said, you're not safe anywhere. Your rights are not safe anywhere. Unfortunately, you see it seems like the universities are essentially these little havens for administrators who want to enact, again, like these dogmatic policies that really push their own ideology and their political agendas, and again, severely punish dissenting ideas. And this is something that, again, it's in every campus that I've seen. You can find a policy that either walks right up to that legal line because they want to make sure their ideas are most represented, or it crosses it. I mean, in a lot of cases, like I said, there's no shortage of schools to sue for us. I mean, we could use the help if others want to get involved.
What was the University of Houston case?
Yeah, so the University of Houston, and this is a great segue actually into the Title IX issue that I want to touch on. So So when we went against University of Houston, they have a harassment policy there. And I kind of mentioned this earlier when we were talking about how schools have these various harassment policies. They'll have their Title IX policy, and then they'll have like an anti-discrimination policy or an anti-harassment policy. And I'll say, so our student members, they leaked us this video of a student government association being briefed on what hate speech was and whether it was protected on campus, because there was a hate speech incident in student government association, and they wanted to know kind of like, what are our rights on campus? What should we be expecting? And so they had the legal counsel come on the campus, come and brief them. And it was a kind of virtual video. And along with the faculty advisor. And they specifically said that, hate speech is protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution, but not so much on this campus. And if you're talking about sexual orientation, or if you're talking about racial issues, you're most likely violating our anti-harassment policy. And when I saw that video, my mind just exploded, because I was like, this is a public school. I can't believe a lawyer was telling this to students, that he was telling them that their free speech rights were not protected on their public campus. So we went and, looked at this policy, and it, the way that it was written was so broad that you could be reported for harassment for merely expressing a mainstream political opinion. It just required someone to be offended by your thoughts. We had students telling us that they didn't want to table on some major issues that were happening in Texas, such as the transgenders in sports issues, at the time, the pro-life issue and the debate with Dobbs and all of that. People did not want to talk about those issues on campus. We had clubs telling us they actively withheld holding tabling events on these issues because they were afraid they'd be accused of harassment based on that policy. So this is something that was a serious concern, because again, this is on campus in college. This is where you should be discussing all of these things, right? You should be discussing politics and social issues and kind of exploring various ideas. But that just was something that the students did not feel comfortable doing if they had a conservative viewpoint on that campus. So we won very decisively against them very quickly. The policy was so obviously bad. It only took 4 months to crush them in court. And and we settled we had a very decisive settlement with them, and we got $30,000 of fees out of them as well, which is about 3 years worth of tuition for the school. And again, if anyone who litigates out there, I always encourage folks to get them between a rock and a hard place and get those fees paid, because that is something that if you can, in addition to getting, so we also made them promise to change, we rewrote the policy for them to include the Davis standard, which is a Supreme Court precedent definition of harassment. And then we had them promise to never bring it back, the old policy back. And then we got the fees out of them. That was exactly what we needed to happen there. That's exactly what we need to see out of their campuses. Get them to change the policies, promise to never bring them back, and then make them suffer financially for it. Because sometimes that's the only language they know, is getting them to have to pay money and embarrass them by saying, look, we got 3 years of tuition out of this school. So going public with that kind of information is something that really hurts the school's reputation and really upsets them. And that's kind of what we're going for here. Because again, clearly it's been going on for years. As you mentioned earlier, some of the stuff that had been happening on campus back in the 90s and even before that, we need to start playing hardball with the universities, because they have been getting away with a lot for a long time. And one more thing on Title IX, because this is something that I'm very concerned about, and Speech First is very concerned about, regarding free speech being protected under the new rules being proposed by the Biden administration with regards to Title IX sexual harassment policies. Now, they're basically, they're adding gender identity as a protected class. While they're doing that, they are also removing this Supreme Court precedent that I mentioned, the Davis standard, which had a very high bar for what speech could actually be considered harassing conduct. It said that it had to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive in order for speech to be considered harassing conduct. All three of those items had to have been met in order for a school to actually process a student under Title IX. Now, the Biden administration is throwing that standard out, which means that now they are saying it could be severe or pervasive, which means it could be a microaggression, or it could be just like a one-time incident. And it's getting to the point where you're like, all right, I know exactly where this is going. It's going to lead to compelled speech. Definitely. You already saw students, I think it was a middle school in Wisconsin, I want to say, that tried to process students under Title IX policy because they refused to use the they them pronoun for one of their peers, 3 middle school students. This is exactly what we are going to see happen if these rules are solidified, because once gender identity is a protected class and you remove this strict standard for what speech can be considered harassing conduct, it's gonna play off each other. Professors who don't affirm gender identity, people who don't want to use certain pronouns, everyone's gonna get reported for Title IX harassment policy. So it really opens the floodgates. And we already know universities are pretty much bad actors in a lot of these fronts. They've showed a propensity for wanting to tamp down on speech. This is definitely going to give them that federal mandate to go after people more than ever before.
Yeah. I understand why you want to keep the Davis standard, but every time I hear the words objectively offensive, I want to bang my head on the desk, because it is a meaningless formulation, offense being by definition subjective. A couple of questions from the audience I would like to get to. You mentioned this in passing, but I'd like to maybe give it a little more attention. Pro-life groups, how are they generally treated, and what kind of troubles do they have on university campuses?
Yeah. Pro-life groups, they do struggle quite a bit, probably now more than they did before. So oftentimes they'll be considered, it depends if they already existed on the campus before the DOPS decision, right? Like if you're a new pro-life group who's trying to get started right now, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to get your club recognized by the Student Government Association. This is why I actually encourage students to, especially conservative students and religious students, to run for student government positions, because they honestly, when it comes to clubs and club recognition, the ones who have the most control over that is the student government associations. They control millions of dollars actually of student activity fees, and they get to determine how it's dispersed and what clubs get to have that money, access to that money, and which ones don't. So getting a nice balance of conservatives on Student Government Association would make your lives a lot easier on campus, I think. And this is, again, it doesn't help that they usually also have very like woke far left professors as their faculty advisors as well. So that's not usually helpful. But in a lot of cases, yeah, you'll see pro-life and religious organizations are some of the most discriminated against when it comes to getting recognition on campus. And the excuses they'll give are the one I mentioned earlier, which is that they restrict membership based on certain ideas. Or the other one is that they are redundant. This is one I've seen used time and time again, that it's a redundant organization. And, this is not a good argument. It's easily winnable if you get a strong faculty advisor for your club who supports your club and is willing to go in there and appeal that. You have to do, again, it takes a little bit of work to kind of follow through with this. And it is always a struggle and uphill battle. I used to work for the Alexander Hamilton Society, and we were trying to get clubs recognized all the time on campus. And we weren't even that controversial, honestly. We just wanted students to be able to debate issues on foreign policy. And when the Student Government Associations found out it was a conservative organization, they immediately used the redundancy factor, like, oh, we've already got clubs we've got Model UN, or we've got like Turning Point or YAF or something on campus that already does some of these things. So I mean, obviously Turning Point, all these other ones do struggle as well, but it's definitely, you can make the argument that you're not redundant. Just know that going in, when you're trying to start a club, that you're going to have to make that argument so that you can show the areas where you are unique, because that's the best way to kind of circumvent that issue.
Yeah. Do you work on behalf of faculty? And if not, to whom should faculty turn if they're being targeted for their views?
That's a really excellent question. So we represent our student members in the court of law, but I will say there are a lot of organizations that are interested in defending faculty. We have pretty limited resources, so we do focus on the students primarily. But you're right, there's a serious issue going on with professor free speech and academic freedom right now on campus with regards to their ability to just, we've seen stories of professors who basically just said that they believe that Israel is like the only democracy in the Middle East, and they get in trouble for this. They get investigated for things like this. It's not even a controversial statement in any way, really. It's just like the basic truth. So again, you're seeing professors who are definitely being targeted. We obviously know the Princeton example with Professor Katz. Oftentimes you will see, and this is something I want to point out real quick, because this is something I've seen more and more. You'll see the left does tend to like to use the sexual harassment stuff as a way to prevent professors and other enemies of theirs from getting support from their own side, which is I've seen it times and again with professors, especially because, it's again, not too hard to accuse someone of harassment in these days. And there's like kind of a long history in the country of accusing, having unfounded claims of accusations of sexual harassment. But oftentimes you'll see that as a cudgel on the left. If you speak out as a professor or as a student or anything like that, I've seen students get accused of harassment. I've seen professors get accused of sexual harassment, or say that they didn't report when they were supposed to report, just so that they can't get that support they need from legal organizations or other conservative organizations, because they know that that will make everyone kind of step away and be like, oh no, you're toxic, we don't want to help you anymore because now you've got the sexual harassment claim attached to your name. So that is something the left is definitely using as a tool. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Don't put yourself in a situation where you have those claims against you. But for professors who are looking for help, there are a lot of, so there's the there's Robbie George's relatively new thing, which is the Academic Freedom Alliance. That one is so kind of like essentially how they describe it as a NATO for professors. It's like attack one of us, you attack all of us, and all the names on there are public, and everyone's willing to like fight for each other, and that's a really great one. There's also Alliance Defending Freedom. Oftentimes will step in for professors. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, will sometimes step in for professors. Also, a newer one, America First Legal. They are, they are always willing to step in for professors. I've actually seen them do some really great stuff. So, there are other organizations, and if you reach out to us at speechfirst.org, I'm always happy to refer you to any of these organizations.
Right. A couple of years ago, I was invited to do a speech at the Ohio State University Journalism School. And my speech was about why they should close the journalism school, because, journalism majors are useless, and it's not something you need to do to become a journalist. You don't have to go to journalism school to be a journalist, but you do have to go to law school pretty much to be a lawyer, and you have to go to medical school to be a doctor. And one of our audience members know about the state of free speech in the professional schools. What happens if a doctor insists that there are only two genders, or if a law student criticizes critical race theory?
Yeah, well, this is actually a really interesting subject. And I was doing a lot of thinking on the law school front a little while ago, just when that Yale Law School incident happened, where all the law school students shut down an event. That was a debate event about free speech, I believe, and viewpoint diversity, actually, and how we could come together on issues and discuss issues. And they shut it down because they were offended by the fact that they had invited someone from ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, to speak. So, and I started asking myself, I was like, wait, do law schools, do they teach the Constitution? Because these are law students, right? Like they should have this kind of foundational understanding already of rights and understand that. Or that should be kind of a given, right? If you're in law school. And then I actually talked to a lot of lawyers and a lot of law school students, and we did a podcast on it. If you think about it, you go through K through 12 and you're not really getting the best civics education or history education, right? Assuming that you even get just like a mediocre one, then you get to undergrad. There's no Common Core. There's no requirement for history classes. Assuming you're a social sciences major, a lot of law school these days are recruiting like computer science majors or engineering majors, because of what's, where the way technology is going, you need more legally minded people in those fields. So, and computer science, they're not taking a history class, like they're completely focused on something entirely different, unless it's, something they opt in on. And then, for the LSAT, there's no questions about history or the Constitution or the founding principles of our legal system, because it's all reason and logic. And so they get into these law schools, and the first class they take is maybe a con law class, an intro to constitutional law. And if they take that, which it's not often mandated, even if they take that class, they'll still sometimes see themselves, they'll see it taught by a professor who says that the Constitution is racist, or that the country is fundamentally racist. So you're not necessarily guaranteed by the time you finish law school. And by the way, that's like usually the only requirement for constitutional law, unless you are doing actual constitutional law, which a lot of law students don't do. Then you are kind of off the hook at that point to have to take any kind of foundational principle classes. Everything else is case law study. So, and by the time you get out, unless you take that a good con law class, you're not really getting any exposure as a law student. And so, like, yeah, in the medical, I mean, I can't even imagine in the medical profession, honestly, how bad it must be with the transgender stuff, because, especially with what I think the Association of Pediatrics, the American Association of Pediatrics or something, has been putting out a lot on doing surgeries and hormone therapies on children. And this is something that, I mean, I can't imagine how many medical professionals are like, well, the authority, the association who's the authority on these issues, they have all the research, they have all these resources that they pull from. They're supporting things that, you know, a doctor or a medical student might fundamentally disagree with. And it's like, yeah, what do students do in these situations? And what do law school students do in these situations? Now, obviously, law school has the Federalist Society, which is a great network of legally minded folks who are like, you know, into the Constitution and the founding principles. And they do talk about these issues a lot more in depth than you would probably get in a regular curriculum. But medical school doesn't really have that outlet for students who are kind of, you know, trying to find. This is why sometimes you do see these students going to Turning Point chapters or YAL chapters, because they just don't have that access to talk about the social issues that are really concerning them. There is a new organization called Students for America. If you haven't heard of it, I encourage you to look it up. They're trying to branch out and create alumni networks of conservative and like-minded individuals for disciplines that are not your typical like political science or social science discipline, for business majors, or for medical schools is one of the ones that they're focusing on, as well as computer science and tech majors. And the goal here is to create that alumni network so that these students, once they graduate, have mentors who are already working in the field, who can plug them in and connect them with the right people, you know, in the banking industry or in the medical industry. So that they actually, you know, again, like-minded individuals who care about constitutional rights and conservative principles. So.
Well, I think that'll probably do it for us. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Is there anyone from NRI who's going to hop back on and close things out, or is that just going to be it? I'll count to 3 and see if that's going to happen.
We can end.
Sometimes they come back on and ask you for money and things like that. But,
no, I think that should cover it. Thank you so much, Cherise. And
well, thank you all so much for coming.
We have lots
Appreciate
of questions in the chat box. So Cherise, where's the best place that anyone on, you know, if they're having an issue, if their kids are having issues, you know, where should they go to reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go to speechfirst.org, or you can find me on Twitter at Cherise Trump, or you can also email us if there's a specific incident and a story you want us to hear about. Email us at info@speechfirst.org. And that, you know, pretty straightforward email address. But again, feel free to reach out anytime. We do love to hear your stories, and we love to shine a light on those stories. We have a student spotlight series. So if, you know, there's an incident or you know, we really love to hear stories of when students overcome an incident on campus. They're able to stand up and speak their mind without, you know, and are able to challenge the status quo. That's something we really love to promote and to show the public as well.
Great. And I know we've got some extra questions in the chat box, so maybe we can check in with you again as we get into the school year, see what y'all are up to, and just, you know, we'll keep this partnership going, because this is so important, I know, to everyone that joined us, and just important for society. So
yeah, absolutely. Oh, and I did forget to mention, if you are a freshman, or you know anyone who's on campus who's going through freshman orientations, we did launch a tip line off of that, so you can have them email anything that they see that I listed out earlier on, like some crazy woke stuff. If you see that on campus, definitely send it to our tip line, and it's at info@speechfirst.org. You can just send it to the same email address.
Great. And there was questions in the chat box about recording. We are recording this, so we will get this up on YouTube, and anyone who RSVP'd will get the link, and you can share that with others. I think it's important we get the word out, so that'll be available to everyone.
Yeah,
great. Okay, thanks again. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.